Have you ever heard a voice so hauntingly familiar, yet so full of new life, that it made you question whether legends ever truly die? That night, under the golden lights of Ireland's Got Talent, a man from halfway across the world stood trembling behind the microphone. His name was Ramon Dela Cruz, a 42-year-old Filipino janitor from Cebu. He had no fame, no fortune, just a dream that had followed him across oceans. Behind his nervous smile was a story that began long before that stage. Ramon wasn't just another singer chasing fame. He carried a memory, his late father's voice, echoing through every note of Elvis songs they used to sing together back home. To Ramon, Elvis wasn't just music. He was the sound of love, the echo of simpler days, and the heartbeat of a father he never got to say goodbye to. The audience saw only a man in a thrift store suit, clutching an old guitar. But what they didn't see was how that guitar had once belonged to his father, its scratches telling stories of small-town fiestas and late-night lullabies. Among the audience sat a wife, a kind-hearted Irish nurse who had met Ramon at the hospital where he worked part-time. She had seen him mop floors quietly during breaks, humming softly always Elvis. She had urged him to audition, even when he laughed it off, saying, "No one wants to hear a janitor sing." And then there was Liam, one of the show's producers, who had doubted the man at first. To him, Ramon seemed like another nervous contestant. That night would not only change how people saw Ramon but also how the world remembered the spirit of Elvis himself. Because sometimes legends don't die. They're reborn in unexpected souls. And when Ramon began to sing, the world would hold its breath. Ramon Dela Cruz lived a quiet life in the outskirts of Dublin, in a small rented room above an old bakery that always smelled of freshly baked bread and rain. Every morning, before the city awoke, he walked to the hospital where he worked as a janitor. His steps were slow but steady, his heart always humming a tune, an Elvis song, usually Can't Help Falling in Love. At 42, Ramon carried the calmness of someone who had seen life's storms and learned to smile through them. He wasn't bitter, just quietly tired. Years of scrubbing floors, mopping corridors, and eating alone at lunch had etched gentle lines around his eyes. Yet there was something different about him. Even in silence, his eyes seemed to carry music, like a song always waiting to escape. He had come to Ireland 10 years earlier, chasing a better life for his wife and son in Cebu. Every month, he sent a portion of his small earnings back home, sometimes skipping meals to make sure the envelope reached on time. It wasn't much, but it was everything he had to give. After his long shifts, Ramon would sit by the window of his small room, strumming his old, cracked guitar under the dim yellow light. He sang softly, never loud enough for anyone to hear, but enough to make his heart feel full. Every chord carried a piece of his past, the scent of mango trees, his father's laughter, the sound of the sea back home. But lately, the weight of life had grown heavier. The hospital had cut his hours, and bills piled up. Sometimes he wondered if dreams were only for the young and lucky. Still, every time he felt hopeless, he remembered his father's words: music never leaves those who love it. And so, even when life pressed him into silence, Ramon sang. Not for fame, not for applause, but because singing reminded him that somewhere, deep within the noise of survival, his soul was still alive. There came a time when even music began to sound distant. Ramon's life started to blur into long, grey days, cleaning hallways that smelled of disinfectant, listening to voices that never called his name. He moved like a shadow through the hospital, unnoticed and unremembered. But deep inside, a quiet ache was growing, one he could no longer ignore. It had been 5 years since his father passed away. The man who once taught him every Elvis song on that old guitar was gone, and Ramon had been too far away to say goodbye. He remembered the last phone call, a promise to return soon, to sing together again. But work, money, and distance had built walls between dreams and reality. The day he received the news, he sat alone in the hospital storage room, holding his phone in trembling hands, listening to a silence that felt endless. Since then, every note he sang carried guilt. Every strum was an apology that would never be heard. He missed his father, not just as a parent, but as the only person who truly believed in his voice. And yet, life in Ireland had left no space for grief. Rent was due, remittance was expected, and time was cruel. On weekends, when others laughed in pubs, Ramon stayed home, fixing his guitar with glue and hope. He watched old Elvis performances online, whispering harmonies under his breath. Sometimes tears fell without warning, memories spilling out like broken melodies. Then came the letter that changed everything. A notice from the hospital stating that his position might be terminated due to budget cuts. Suddenly, even his fragile stability was at risk. For the first time in years, Ramon questioned everything. What was the purpose of a life spent only surviving? What good was a voice buried in fear? He felt lost between two worlds, one that forgot him and one that no longer existed. But somewhere inside that silence, a spark still waited. And fate, patient and quiet, was already preparing a stage for his rediscovery. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that comes and goes without meaning. Ramon was finishing his shift at the hospital, wiping down the last hallway as sunlight poured in through the glass ceiling. The world outside looked golden, but inside he felt dull and invisible. As he pushed his cleaning cart toward the exit, a soft voice called his name. It was Ive, the nurse who always smiled kindly at him. She carried a flyer in her hand and said she'd just returned from the city centre. "They're holding auditions for Ireland's Got Talent this weekend," she said gently. "You should try," Ramon chuckled politely, shaking his head. He had heard about such shows where dreams met bright lights, but also where ordinary people were often laughed at. The thought of standing on a stage before strangers terrified him. What would they think of a Filipino janitor singing Elvis? But Ive didn't leave it at that. She placed the flyer on his cart and said softly, "You've got something special, Ramon." The world should hear it. That night, back in his small room, he stared at the flyer for hours. The words blurred in his tired eyes, but his heart raced. He picked up his old guitar, fingers trembling, and began to sing "Can't Help Falling in Love." For the first time in years, he didn't just sing for his father, he sang for himself. He imagined the bright lights, the echo of applause, the sound of his father's laughter somewhere beyond the clouds. And then he felt something shift inside him. It wasn't confidence, it was courage. A small, fragile courage that whispered, "Maybe you still have something to give." The next morning, Ramon walked to the audition hall, guitar in hand, his work uniform neatly folded in his bag. His heart pounded with every step. He had no fancy clothes, no backup plan, no one waiting outside. Just a voice, a dream, and the memory of a man who once said, "Never stop singing, son." That was the day everything changed. The day of the audition arrived with skies the color of steel. Ramon stood in line among hundreds of hopeful teenagers with glittering jackets, seasoned performers with confident smiles, and him, a middle-aged janitor holding an aging guitar. The cold wind bit at his fingers, but the real chill came from doubt. Inside the auditorium, laughter and chatter filled the air. He could feel eyes glancing at him, his worn shoes, his trembling hands. A few contestants whispered, wondering if he was lost. But he stayed silent, staring at the stage that seemed miles away. It was the same feeling he'd carried for years, being seen, but never truly noticed. When his name was finally called, his breath caught. He stepped into the spotlight, blinded by brightness, his heart thudding like a drum. For a moment, the crowd blurred into darkness, and only the microphone stood between him and every fear he'd ever known. He remembered his father again, his laugh, his voice, the way he used to strum the guitar beside the sea. He whispered silently, "This one's for you." A murmur moved through the audience. Panic surged inside him, but he closed his eyes and took a shaky breath. Then something miraculous happened. His voice found its rhythm. Each line carried a lifetime of pain and love. He wasn't just imitating Elvis, he was bleeding his soul into every word. The tremble in his voice became power. The sorrow became beauty. The fear became music. The more he sang, the lighter he felt, like every burden he'd ever carried was dissolving into sound. He saw his father in his mind, smiling in approval. He saw a wife in the crowd, tears in her eyes. By the final note, the entire hall was silent, no applause, yet just awe. Ramon stood frozen. Unsure what had just happened, he wasn't seeking validation anymore. He had already won something greater himself.